While the CMC were established as a group back in Call of the Cutie, this is actually the first episode where we get to see more than just a couple minutes of interaction from them. I also find it interesting that the first episode that features the CMC also puts a lot of focus on Fluttershy. Out of all the main six, Fluttershy shows herself to be the most devoted caretaker, as she spends so much of her time nurturing animals, even in the cases where they can be disagreeable. But Stairmaster actually shows us just how quickly Fluttershy can be overwhelmed when she is not working with her natural talents. As the episode begins, we see Rarity is stressing out over her work. We see Sweetie Belle asking whether she might be able to help, and Rarity immediately says no. This is actually the first moment in the series where we find out that Rarity and Sweetie Belle are sisters, and their very first interaction has to do with Sweetie Belle being brushed aside, despite her desire to be helpful. And considering that the only episode in the series that makes Sweetie Belle the main focus is Sister Hoof's social, the starting scene here is actually a really good precursor to that very episode. So I'm glad that I keep finding more of these little nods to continuity. However, when Sweetie Belle does try to help, we begin to understand just why Rarity keeps trying to discourage her sister from helping in the first place. Seems that Sweetie Belle has a knack for causing more trouble than she actually helps with. When Fluttershy arrives, Rarity talks about how she can't understand just how Fluttershy can get Opal Essence to be calm enough to groom. Rarity starts to look troubled when she asks, "Did you use the stare on her?" Now, the only time we know of before this point in the show where Fluttershy used the stare was against the dragon. I don't know whether there might have been other times when Rarity witnessed this ability, but even if it was just that one instance, it is certainly understandable as to why Rarity would be a little troubled by its use. Fluttershy talks about how she doesn't really have any control over the stare when it happens. It just happens. Now this makes me really curious as to whether there really were any other points in Fluttershy's life where she has used this stare, whether she had discovered its use before DRWolf. When the rest of the CMC arrive and talk about a sleepover, Rarity runs into more trouble when she discovers that she doesn't have enough gold silk to fill an order, and thus can't watch the girls. Fluttershy, being the caring nurturer that we know her to be, doesn't hesitate to offer her help in taking care of the CMC. Of course, at this point in the story, Fluttershy is just talking about how cute they are and doesn't seem to realize just what she is in for. Twilight comes along and says that she is heading into the Everfree Forest to get some of her favorite tea from Zecora. Now, maybe I'm forgetting a scene somewhere in the show, but just how often do we see Twilight drinking tea outside of this episode? But then again, maybe Twilight just enjoys Zecora's company. As the evening begins, Fluttershy is quickly getting overwhelmed by just how energetic the CMC are being. And even though they are getting into everything, it is easy to see that they are just being curious kids. And I have to admit that they are coming up with some rather adorable moments here as well. Although, when they are assembling the table here, it seems a bit odd that they couldn't quite figure it out. I mean, they are able to fix up their own clubhouse in the very next episode, and that turned out pretty well. When Fluttershy suggests that they play a game, we get some cuteness overload.
I'm the world champ, you know. I bet you can't beat me.
Having just come off of reviewing Sonic Rainboom, I am thoroughly enjoying all these little moments from Fluttershy. When the girls are being put to bed, we get a very soothing melody from Fluttershy. For her first solo song in the entire series, this really works for her. Of course, we get the first solo song from Sweetie Belle as well, and she actually sounds really talented too, even though her version of the song is far more upbeat. But all this singing is causing the chickens to become restless, so the CMC decide that they are going to try hurting them. This leads to a very rare moment from Fluttershy when she is actually yelling at them to stop, showing that even Fluttershy has her limits. When Fluttershy is trying to get the chickens back into their coop though, we get to see her using the stare.
In you go.
Now, Fluttershy had stated earlier on that she has no control over the stare when it happens. It just happens. In this case, we can see that she had reached a point of frustration with the CMC and wasn't willing to be patient with the chickens. So it makes me rather curious as to why this particular instance warranted use of the stare. So, after the CMC are put back into bed, we hear Scootaloo's voice coming out of Sweetie Belle? What? I never noticed that before. Anyways, the CMC noticed that one of the chickens has wandered off into the forest and it doesn't take long for them to want to go after it. When Fluttershy discovers that the CMC are missing, we can see just how terrified she is about going into the forest herself. Now, we may not know just how much Fluttershy understands about the creatures in the Everfree Forest, but it is admirable to see her willing to act despite her fears. Although the same can't be said about the CMC here, they don't seem to have any idea about the dangers they are getting themselves into. And we hear Applebloom come up with one of the most well-known memes in the Brony fandom about Scootaloo. We see Fluttershy trying her utmost to find the CMC, despite all her moments of panic. But she still manages to keep her wits about her even with all of her fears. The appearance of the cockatrice here was actually rather surprising for me the first time I watched this episode. I didn't think the writers could have put something like this in a children's show, and they still managed to pull it off rather nicely. And the design is actually rather impressive as well. With the CMC in full panic mode, Fluttershy is still trying to do her utmost to protect them. She even starts using the stare, knowing full well what looking at the cockatrice will do to her. This is a very defining moment for Fluttershy when we see her willingness to risk all for the sake of the fillies. I've mentioned before about how Fluttershy has the most caring and nurturing aspects out of all of the main six, and this moment shows us just how deeply those instincts run. The episode comes to an end with Fluttershy talking about how she shouldn't have been biting off more than she could chew, which is an okay lesson, certainly something that children should be learning, but there is a much more relevant lesson here as well, as we can see with Rarity's actions when she is trying to get the girls to come with her. It isn't enough to simply raise your voice and show some firmness when dealing with children. Fluttershy was doing that same thing earlier on in the episode, and the CMC still weren't interested in doing what she wanted. But there is something here that shows what will help in getting children to listen to you. The CMC were ready to respect Fluttershy after they could both see and understand just how much she was willing to do in caring for them. And that can go a very long way when you are dealing with children. So even though it isn't the lesson that Fluttershy talks about, I think that it is the much more relevant lesson to learn. Overall, Stairmaster is an episode that I actually enjoyed re-watching much more than I thought I would. There are quite a few adorable moments that made me chuckle. There is more of a lesson here than meets the eye, and even though Fluttershy facing against a cockatrice isn't quite as memorable as seeing her face a dragon, it still makes for a very inspiring moment. So, did you find anything new about this episode that you hadn't noticed before? What sort of things do you look for when you think of an enjoyable episode? Do you have any ideas about how Fluttershy's stare actually works? I would like to hear your thoughts about Stairmaster, and here's to hoping that we'll be seeing more of Fluttershy's inspiring moments in the future. I am Dr. Wolf, and I look forward to hearing from you.